Chapter 14. Sunday evening. "Really?" she asked Thaddeus. "Did you just do that after I made you this nice new perch?" Doreen looked around, but she had no newspapers up here. There should have been some nearby, but she'd cleaned them all out the last time she'd cleaned up his mess. Once again, back downstairs to Nan's trusty stack of papers. She returned, cleaned up his most recent mess, then put a folded newspaper underneath him, and stored the others off to the side. Needing to clean the room out a little bit now that she had made space for him, she took the bags of clothing to the top of the stairs, and then pushed the box there too, so it was all stacked up in the same place. "It's not much," she said out loud, "but it is something. Maybe in the morning I can get up and do the rest. Wouldn't that be nice? To have this room completely cleaned out?" On that thought, she had a quick shower and headed to bed. When she woke in the morning, she felt rested. Stronger. More at peace. Then Steve's visit last night came sliding back into her consciousness, and she could feel herself stiffening with tension all over again. She wondered if she should mention it to Mac. It seemed more alarmist than common sense, but if anything did happen to her, he wouldn't have a clue where to start looking. Knowing he would be more than pissed at her if something did happen to her, and she had not shared this with him, she uploaded the video to an email and sent it to Mac with a note, "If I disappear." Chuckling, she got dressed and headed to the kitchen. It was Monday. Today Scott was coming, and she couldn't be happier. Today she'd be rid of all the big furniture, hopefully. Downstairs, her usual coffee made, she looked at the stove and wondered about an omelet, still the only thing she could cook confidently. She wasn't super hungry, but the salad last night hadn't been very substantial. Making a decision, she created a simple cheese omelet. She had to smile at her successful adventure. She didn't know how long Scott would be here, and another round of moving out the antiques could be quite stressful, particularly for the animals. Given that, she fed them first, then sat down to eat. With her first bite, her phone rang. What the hell was that all about? Mac snapped into her ear. When she could swallow the bite in her mouth, she explained. "Well, he threatened me, and I realized I probably hadn't said very much about him, and so, if something happens to me," she said, "you wouldn't have any clue where to go looking for the guilty party." She thought about it, then added, "It just seemed like common sense to send it to you. Sorry if it seemed a little over the top." Of course, if she got a rise out of him, good. It was never good for Mac to get too complacent around her. "Yes, of course, it's common sense to send it to me," he said, his voice tired. "And I'm not mad that you sent it. I'm mad that it happened in the first place." "I understood him to be an old friend of Penny's," she said, "and I don't know what that means in this instance. But he's obviously angry about what happened to Penny, and Penny is obviously trying to use the argument that we faked her attacking me." There was silence on the other end, and Mac laughed. "It's a good thing we have photos of the wound matching up with the murder weapon, or the attempted murder weapon, that you couldn't possibly have hit yourself with. It couldn't even have fallen off one of your racks and hit you with enough force to cause that kind of damage. Plus you saw me, right?" "Yes," he said, "I came out while she was attacking you. No way she'll get off on that charge." Doreen felt some of her tension ease back. "Well, she certainly has Steve believing her story, so I'm sure a lot of people will. I'm the upstart. She's the one who's been here forever. And murdered her own brother," he reminded her. "Tried to kill Hornby." "Sure, but look at the circumstances," she said gently. "You know, a lot of people will have sympathy for her. Most will understand why she did what she did. And shooting Hornby." She stopped and frowned. "Nobody liked him anyway." "True," he said thoughtfully. "On that note, we should probably do a reenactment, so we have a video for a court trial." "What does that mean?" "It means I want you to come into the station today, and we'll take more pictures so the guys can put it through reconstruction software and show how it happened." Okay, she said, but not until after Scott arrives, and only if he doesn't need me. Right, he said. That should be today too. Absolutely, at least I haven't heard anything different. And I really need this stuff gone, she said fervently. What about the little stuff? I'm not sure, she said. I sent Fen an email last night looking to see if he knows anybody else who can recommend a buyer for some of these items. And what about your Scott guy? Can he give you names? I have no clue, she said. He told me that he would send me some names, but that hasn't happened yet. He's pretty excited about the gold mine he's found here. Maybe he's just too distracted. Do you know how many pieces he has taken? No clue. Besides, he's hopefully taking dozens more today. But that reminds me. The other 2 chairs haven't been picked up yet. She frowned. And he didn't give me the contact information for them. He's coming this morning, so maybe you can get that to happen today too. Right, she said, because $500 is $500. Is that what someone's paying for 2 chairs? He asked in surprise. Yes. That's the deal Scott made. Honestly, I don't know what I would do with just 2 chairs. And that'll leave me with literally 2 chairs left. If need be, he said in that casual male we can do anything attitude, we can do a dump run. Right, she said. Also, do you have a place in town where I can drop off chairs like that? Like a church bazaar or something where people can come and get stuff they might need? Sure, he said, a lot of charities around here might pick that up from your house. Really? She asked. That would be awesome because then I don't have to fit all this stuff into my car. I already have bags and boxes to take to Wendy's again. He laughed. Will you ever get done with that master bedroom? It's almost there, she said. I've got everything out of the closet, but now I could use a dresser and maybe a set of shelves. We took out a set of shelves already from the master closet that were pretty well stuffed with all kinds of junk, but if you want it back in there, we can move it back. I'll think about it, she said. Just then she heard vehicles. Hey, I've got to finish eating before Scott gets here. What are you eating? A cheese omelet, she said triumphantly. And a piece of toast and fresh coffee. Wow, okay, so that's just mean, he said. I missed breakfast. She could now hear voices. I gotta go, she said. It sounds like they're here. She hastily took a couple more bites as she waited for people to come up the front steps. She still had half an omelet in front of her, and that didn't look like something she wanted to warm up later. She put it on top of her piece of toast and cut it in half. Now it looked like an egg sandwich, and she walked to the front door, munching on it. She opened the door to see the moving men with a massive truck backing up into her driveway. Scott looked at her and smiled. She waved, finished her sandwich half, and realizing they would still be a bit, raced back to the kitchen and picked up the other half. She gobbled it down in 4 bites and moved her dishes to the sink. She washed her hands and went back out front. Scott was propping open the front screen door. Muggs was out on the driveway, making a nuisance of himself. She called him over and he came back, woofing and barking, his tail wagging. Since when did you become such a social dog? She asked him. He just woofed some more. Scott called out a few of the men's names. She recognized a couple of them. They grinned at her and said, I guess we're back for more. Lots more apparently, she said in a laugh. I'll be happy when the house is empty. I can imagine, they said. Inside, Scott stopped in the living room, looked at the 2 chairs and said, Did those chairs not get picked up? She shook her head. No, and you didn't leave me the buyer's contact information. He picked up the 2 chairs and put them beside her pot chairs under the window. These aren't going, he said to his moving men and motioned and pointed to the other chairs, then pulled out his phone and called somebody. Hey, are you not taking those 2 chairs? Today's Monday, and you said you'd come over the weekend. Doreen heard a whiny voice on the other end, but couldn't make out the words. Scott shook his head. This morning or they're gone, he said, and he hung up. He looked at her and said, if he doesn't take them, I will. I might get a better price anyway. She smiled up at him. Can you take the other two? I'll see what we have room for. I can only really take what I know we can sell, so that's the priority. Many of the pieces were smaller this time, but they still required a lot of wrapping, and by now the moving men were working in shifts. With the garage door open and the bigger pieces already wrapped and put in the moving truck, she stepped back and watched the organized chaos in amazement. When Scott came to find her an hour later, she was in the kitchen, doing research on Crystal. Doreen? Startled, she turned to look at him and hopped up to her feet. Hey. The guy who wants those 2 chairs is here. She nodded and said, good. It's $500, right? Scott handed her the $500 in cash and said, that's yours, and I've given him the 2 chairs. Perfect, she said, loving the feel of that much money in her hand. She folded it up and tucked it into her purse with the other money, just now realizing how wealthy she was becoming. At least for her, it was wealthy. It also reminded her about going to the bank. And she couldn't have been more grateful. She motioned to the coffee pot and said, would you like me to put on a fresh pot? His eyes lit up and he nodded. And then I'll go back out and work on the garage. We've got to get a lot of that stuff before we head down to the basement. There's no room to haul the basement furniture through the garage if you don't clean out the garage first. He nodded, but he was back a moment later and said, there's a woman at the door looking for you. Surprised, Doreen headed out to her front steps. There was Clara. Hi, surprised to see you here? I know, Clara said, and obviously it's a really bad time. I'm on my way into work. I just wondered if you'd found out anything about Crystal. Doreen was overcome with guilt. Not only had she not found very much, but she hadn't put too much effort into it. She shook her head. No, not yet, she said. Sometimes it can take time. Clara's face fell. I know, she said. I just figured that you being as good as you were. Feeling that was more than a little unfair, and yet, hating to disappoint a bereft mother, Doreen motioned to the moving men and said, I'm also involved in a lot of things right now that cut into my time, and I do want privacy for the work I have to do, she said, her voice lowering at the end. I'm sorry. I didn't even think of that, Clara said, glancing around. It's not exactly something you can do as part of a tea session, is it? She backed down the steps to get out of the way of the men. Doreen followed them as they moved out more stuff from the dining room, remembering the fragile china dishes. She called out, those dishes aren't wrapped. They're just the way you guys put them in there the last time. The men nodded and said, we have special boxes for these. At that, Clara said, look. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude. Backing up over the grass, she added, I'll talk to you later. Actually, Doreen said, speaking softly, I need a picture, but most helpful would be an aged version of what Crystal would look like now. Do you have any photos of her? I know she's grown up now and will look very different, but it would be something. And also a picture of your ex-husband and his new wife. Doreen was hoping to scan those in, and then ask Google to find more matching images online. It was a thought anyway. Surprised, Clara said, oh my goodness, yes, of course. That's foolish of me. Of course you need those things. I can access them at work. I'll email some of those photos. Did she have any favorite toys, and did they go missing at the same time? Clara stopped, looked at her and said, yes, she did. How did you know? Doreen didn't say anything, but it made sense. The problem was, only toys had disappeared so far in this other child's case, and that made her more than a little worried. Like a teddy bear, a little doll. Do you have any photos of those? Clara hesitated. I don't know, she said honestly. But I can look. Good. And in that email, write down anything you know about what disappeared with her. The clothing she had on, if her pillow went, whatever toys went, if she had a little girl purse, anything. She wrote down her email on a notepad and handed it to her. Clara, obviously reassured that Doreen was taking this seriously, gave her a bright smile and said, "I will, and thank you." She dashed down the driveway, getting around the big truck and into her small red car. Doreen stood in the doorway, staying out of the way of the moving men as they carried box after box from the dining room. She walked down after the last one and watched as they carefully repackaged the dishes into boxes meant specifically for China. She was amazed at the care they took. "You see, this is why you need to take these dishes," she said, pointing. "Because I wouldn't have taken anywhere near this kind of care." They grinned at her. Just then, somebody came up from the basement, and he had a big box of silverware. He put it down, and she smiled. "It's hard to imagine those things cutting centuries' worth of food, isn't it?" At that, he nodded and pulled out a velvet box for all the silverware as well, each one having separate slots and sections for each type of utensil. She watched in appreciation, pulling out her phone, asking the guys, "Do you mind if I take some photos of this?" They shook their heads as she filmed them packing up the china and the silverware. They had just finished when one of the couches and the pot chairs were brought out directly from the garage and down the driveway. They were loaded into the back of the truck, then a dining room table went on top with more chairs above it. She grinned in delight, knowing part of the garage was already empty. But she also realized it would take time to finish the move. She caught sight of Scott talking to somebody. "Scott, you didn't give me the name of someone to check out the smaller items in the house." "No," he said. "I have somebody coming here to meet us today." He looked at his watch, and just then, a white SUV/van combo she'd never seen before drove up and parked in front of her house. She looked at Scott, who nodded when he saw the tall, gangly woman walking up the sidewalk all in black. Scott stepped forward. "Agatha," he said, shaking her hand. "This is Doreen." Agatha looked at Doreen, her face not breaking a smile. But she shook her hand politely enough. Scott said, "Let's come on inside and take a look." They walked back to the house and stepped inside. "I also have somebody coming over to look at the books," Doreen said. "Today?" Agatha asked. "I believe so." She looked at Scott and he nodded. "John's coming, isn't he?" "He was supposed to come earlier, but he got delayed." Agatha stopped in the living room, her gaze going from object to object to object, landing on various knickknacks on the wall and then on the mantel. She picked up the blue vase, tilted it over, studied the impression underneath, and smiled. "This would fetch a decent penny. This is probably 10, maybe 15,000 right here." Doreen gasped, then held her breath, as Agatha shook it ever so gently and then carefully upended the contents. Scott and Doreen chuckled. "We found those in there last time," she said. "We were looking for a way to hold them. We thought they were marbles, but they're too big." "They are indeed too big," Agatha said, rolling them around in her fingers. "But I have seen such things before." She put them down along with the vase on the mantel and picked up the small clock beside it. And that started it. She went over piece by piece. By the time she had examined everything in the living room, she turned to Doreen and said, "Do you have anything else?" Mutely, Doreen led the way into the dining room. The guys had moved all the boxes of china, but still there were pictures and candlesticks on the wall. Agatha beelined for the candlesticks, nodded when she checked a few things underneath, and muttered when she disconnected one from the wall and checked underneath. She turned to look at Doreen. "These are 16th century. We'd be more than happy to sell them through Christie's." Doreen's jaw dropped at that. "But they're just candlesticks." At that, Scott chuckled. "Doreen likes contemporary stuff," he said by way of explanation to Agatha. She caught the moment of disgust in Agatha's gaze before she shuttered it away. Doreen felt she had to apologize. I'm sorry, she said. I just don't have any appreciation for this stuff, so I'd much rather not have it around. I don't want to damage it. Somebody else will enjoy it much more than I will. Agatha nodded. This painting as well, she said, and those two paintings. Those two are a matched set, and this one is a well-known French painter from the early 1900s. The three of them will fetch a very nice price. I hate to ask, but what's a very nice price? Agatha looked at the three paintings, shrugged, and said, probably 100,000. Doreen, her hand to her chest, sagged against the wall. Are you serious? Scott shrugged and said, this is why you shouldn't listen to me when it comes to items I'm not an expert in. I didn't think they had any value. At that, Agatha burst out laughing. So far, they are the most valuable things in the house. Except for the books, Doreen said apologetically. I think Scott said they're more valuable. Agatha turned to look at Scott. Really? He nodded slowly. I think so. But we'll have to wait for John to be sure.